I think this video is going to be a game changer for a lot of you. If you've ever struggled to understand what phase means or what proper phase alignment is, I'm going to break all that down for you. This video is going to help build your foundation of knowledge so that you can go into any situation and never, ever have to worry about phase alignment issues ever again. We're going to get into exactly what phase is, what it does to your music, and then I'm going to highlight some examples using drum replacement software so you can make sure that your drum samples are always in phase, and then you can extend these concepts into making sure your guitars and everything else are totally aligned. As a thank you for you spending your time with me today, I have a link to download my free rock and metal mixing cheat sheet in the description. There's tons of great starting points to help you EQ and compress things really quickly. And again, that's my gift to you. In audio engineering, phase just refers to the position of a sound wave in its cycle. All sound waves travel in these repeating cycles that go up and down, okay? So when we talk about phase, what we're really looking at how the peaks and the valleys of two different sounds line up with each other. When we say two sounds or two microphones are in phase with each other, all we really mean is that the peaks of one wave match up with the peaks of the other, and vice versa. The valleys also match up with the valleys. Now, when we say samples are out of phase with each other, all we really mean is that the peaks of one sound happen to match up pretty closely with the valleys of the other. And when they're perfectly on top of each other, we say that this is 100% out of phase or 180 degrees out of phase. This causes the sound to cancel out with each other. So when you're thinking about phase, just think of this as like an ocean wave, okay? If two of the different waves happen to crash together at the exact same time, they will always make a bigger wave. But if one wave is going up while another wave is going down and they crash together, they don't really add together, and so they leave the water flat. So those waves are out of phase. So what we're really trying to do is just minimize this flat water phenomenon when we mix our music. Now, audio doesn't have to be just in phase or out of phase. It can exist in between. I'll show you in this example. So if we have the same tone and we simply double the track, every point is just going to add together and it's just going to make a bigger version of this same waveform. However, if we shift the starting point, which means if we put one of these slightly out of phase or has a different start point from the other one, when we add these points together, they don't add the same way as they did before. The sound we get out at the end is a little bit different. So to help visualize this, I'm using this plugin by my buddy, the Him DSP. This is called Sub Ninja, but this plugin is great for visualizing what's going on underneath a certain frequency range in our audio. I'm just going to nudge this waveform out of alignment, okay? So I'm going to shift the phase farther away, and we're going to see what happens to the output of the audio. Now, we're going to use this as an oscilloscope, and we'll watch what the output waveform looks like as we shift the phase of this waveform. So now we're steady here. I'm going to shift the waveform. And you can see that as we get farther and farther away from each other, the audio is actually decreasing. Okay, and it's barely audible right now. If we zoom back in to see what we did, is we effectively shifted this top waveform 180 degrees out of phase. So we lose that sound, we lose the signal. Cool, so that works for a single tone. So what about complicated tones like guitars or a drum? When you have sounds that have mixtures of different frequencies, you're gonna get a lot of masking going on at the same time as the phase cancellation. There's a lot of people that are just learning to mix, and even some pros have a hard time identifying what is going on when you have complex sounds and only some things are out of phase. Let's add another tone to this, but this time, this tone is going to continuously increase in frequency. So now as I play all three of these at the same time and I shift just this, we're going to get cancellation of just this tone and not of this complex tone that's continuously changing. And as I shift the phase of these two tones, so they become more and more out of phase, you'll notice that the waveform keeps shrinking, right? But at the same time, you also hear this other thing continuously increase. So you're still getting the same phase cancellation with these complex sounds. It's just in one tiny region, right? And you can hear that tone come right back as we get closer to these being totally aligned. So if you take that concept and think about it in terms of a guitar or the top and bottom mics on a snare drum, and just moving the phase or moving the timing of one of those mics to try to make those oscillations match up with each other is really challenging because you have a lot of sounds from all the different frequency ranges. So while you might get some that are perfectly aligned, others will now become misaligned. So a lot of these auto alignment tools I find just make things sound confusing and blurry and weird. But I have a much simpler strategy that anybody should be able to use right now in their music. Now, a lot of people that are mixing drums in a home studio tend to replace their drum sounds if they're recording them live. That's exactly what I have here. So we have this snare top mic. Just going to bypass this triggering program, and I'll just play the top snare. Sounds okay, but it could sound bigger and larger than life, right? I'm using Trigger 2 by Steven Slate, and I have some drum samples. I love all the Bogren Digital stuff. They have some of the best drum samples, hands down. And this snappy snare sounds like that. So I like to combine these two drum samples together because you get some of the snap from the snappy snare, and then you get a lot of like body and grit from this chungy blend. But we have to be very careful when we start mixing different samples on top of each other because their waveforms are going to add together when they're played back at the same time. There could be some phase problems. Again, that just means that some of the waveforms or some of the frequencies are not timed exactly the same. And that's going to happen regardless of any sample. Some high frequency stuff might be out of time when the low frequency stuff is in phase. You're never going to have a perfect compromise. You have to use your ears. And shifting samples around can oftentimes do more damage than good. So you have to ask yourself, for each instrument that you're trying to phase align, we have to decide what is some of the most important characteristics that we want to make sure that this snare has when they're both combined. So for me, I want a punchy snare. I want a snare that has a nice low mid-range thwack to it. It's usually around 200 hertz. So what I like about using Sub Ninja is that this top waveform is everything below 193 hertz or whatever we set this to. And this bottom waveform is the full sound coming out. So we can keep an eye on just the lower frequencies in that snare to make sure that we're not having big phase problems in that lower region of the snare drum. So if I just play this, again, this is the full spectrum, and then this is just everything below about 200 hertz. This other snare. But when we play them together, this is what we get. So how do we know if there's a phase problem? And how do we fix it? For the snare, the body is the most important characteristic that I want to make sure is maintained. And instead of sliding one of these samples back and forth like we did earlier, I'm just going to do a polarity inversion. Almost every DAW, in fact, every DAW I know about has these little tools that have this circle and this line through it. That is polarity inversion. That is going to take the sample and flip it 180 degrees out of phase. The strategy here is just to click this and listen just to the body of the snare. Don't listen to the high-end snap. Don't listen to the room afterwards. Just listen to the most important characteristic, which is that body, that crack, okay? One of these positions is going to sound better than the other. So when it's phase inverted, we're losing that punch. There's almost like a deep tone that the snare is missing when we invert this polarity. Listen one more time. It's almost like a like right in the very beginning, right? Now, if we look at Sub Ninja, we can use this to get an idea of how correlated those two snares are. meaning how closely are they timed for frequencies below 200 hertz, right? So we can really focus on what's happening when these two samples are combined. Let's look at how big the peak is as both these samples are normally. Now when I flip the phase, you see that it decreases the size every time, right? And if we get rid of this and go back to the original phase that we had, now it's getting bigger, bigger, bigger. But if you look at the full waveform, it's really hard to tell because all those high frequencies are masking it. So this offers a really quick visual way to look at combining two sources to know if you're phase aligned or not. Now, I do want to mention that just because we're inverting the phase, that doesn't mean it's perfectly in line. If you limit the number of options that you have to just phase inverted and regular, it helps you make a decision faster. Anytime you do these phase alignment things, you need to move quickly, otherwise your ears are going to forget what you heard. Okay, let's go on to another example, this time with kick drums. What's important to me for a kick drum is to make sure that we have that thump. All right, so I have two samples I really like to use. This is Sumo Sub, again, that's Bogren Digital, and then I have Sub Kick. I think that's from Get Good Drums. So naturally, most people would just throw on a drum sampler and just be done. But that's a recipe for disaster. That's what amateur people do. We're not amateurs. We watch YouTube and learn things. So we need to check the phase or the timing of those frequencies that we care about to make sure that we keep that low energy in our kick drum. Just solo the Sumo Sub Kick and see what it looks like on Sub Ninja. Let's check out the sub kick now. Tons of low energy and bass in that. Now when we combine them, let's see what happens. Sounds pretty good. Now we need to invert the phase of one of these samples. It really doesn't matter which one. So we'll just do this one. So let's listen to the low energy, make sure that we're not losing that power that we had. So if this waveform, this little blob gets smaller, we're probably out of phase. Oh, wow. So when we flip the polarity, we lose almost all the sub energy. And you can also see the waveform. Look at how much it changes on the top spectrum. When we get it in phase, look at how much bigger these waveforms are. And out of phase. And by the way, taking these faders and just keep pushing more the sub energy is not going to fix the problem. It's going to make your kick drum out of balance. Right, you could push this up and say, oh, now there's way more sub energy. But guess what? We lose all of the click in the top end in the space that was there originally. So the only way to really maintain that balance is to make sure that you're making good choices with your phase inversion. Anytime you have an instrument with multiple microphones set up, some sound will blend into all the different microphones. The timing is going to be slightly off for all of them. That's just physics. Sound travels at a finite rate through air. So what that means for us is that anytime we have multiple microphones like that, we need to go through all of those microphones, do the polarity inversion, and then pick which one emphasizes those frequencies that we care most about. And we need to do it systematically. If you look at a drum recording, we have snare drums top and bottom. We have kick drums in and out. We have a bunch of cymbals. We have overheads left and right. We have room mics. All of these microphones are recording the sound at the same time. And so they all have that phase relationship between all of them. And again, phase relationship just means that there's a timing component. The sound gets into these microphones all slightly differently from each other. So they're all related. So what I recommend doing is start with the close source microphones. That's going to be the primary source for us hearing that instrument. Make sure that those are all optimized like I showed in those examples earlier. So once you've optimized, for example, the low end of a kick drum or the punch of a snare drum, then you need to also check your drum cymbals. because some of that kick drum, some of that snare drum is going to get into these microphones. When you go to adjust the polarity of your cymbals, sometimes you'll have the overhead on the left side on its own track. What I recommend doing is sending all these to a drum cymbal bus or a group track so that you can just invert the polarity of your group track so you don't have to try to flip between all these channels and hear the differences. That's not an effective way, and you're going to forget the vision you're going for. So when you flip the polarity of your cymbals, listen to the low end of the kick drum, listen to the punch of the snare, and find which one sounds the best. Now, if you find that, for example, your cymbal bus or your rooms are affecting the low energy of your kick drum, something you can do is filter out all the sub-frequencies from either the room or the cymbals to remove all those frequencies so they can't negatively add together with your close mics. But if you do this, make sure you're using a linear phase EQ. So for example, if you look to see what I did, I was having that exact problem with the rooms. So on my room bus, I actually have a high pass filter right at about 180 hertz, and it's linear phase. That way we're removing all these frequencies that could be affecting the low energy of the kick drum. That's more of a technical tip, but I wanted to throw that out there because a lot of times these problems can be solved by using an EQ to clean up low energy so you don't get weird phase cancellations in the low end. But ultimately, trust your gut, use your ears. If you know going into your songs that you're never going to be able to perfectly phase align all the microphones, you're going to stop dwelling on that and you'll just listen to the things that really make a difference in your mixes, especially having a punchy snare and a powerful kick drum. So if you were able to perfectly phase align everything, our brains would essentially perceive that as all the drums living in the same ball of space, which would honestly be very confusing. It would not be stereo anymore. I actually don't know what it would be. What would it be? I think it'd probably be mono. If anybody knows, leave a comment. So to quickly recap everything that we talked about in this video, all phase really is the timing difference between two different sound sources. In the world we live in, all these sound sources are complicated and they compose of all different kinds of frequencies. And because we're using microphones that exist in different distances away from the sound source and in different places, there will always be an inherent phase issue between those. But that's not a bad thing. It's only a bad thing if it's taking away from the characteristic tone that we're going for the vision of our song. So instead of trying to nudge samples left and right and trying to perfectly phase align everything, just use a polarity inversion and listen for those most important frequencies for that particular instrument. I showed you how you can use an oscilloscope or something like Sub Ninja so you can visually observe if you have phase cancellation and the frequencies of interest. I also covered the fact that you don't just want to try to phase optimize drum samples. You need to phase optimize the entire picture of a drum kit or all the microphones on a guitar cabinet. Start with the close-sourced mics, the ones that represent the instrument the most, and then work your way out to the microphones that don't have as much impact. If you find that the sub-energy is getting all screwed up from room microphones or overheads, try adding a linear phase EQ to that and filter off the low energy. You can also do that with guitar cabinets. So I'm super curious to know, do you use plugins to help you auto-align the phase of instruments? I know there's a bunch of them out there, but I find that I do a much better job mixing if I just use my ears and occasionally an oscilloscope like Sub Ninja. And if there's anything that I left unclear, please leave a comment so I can respond to it. That way, anybody that comes to watch the video will learn from it. I want to remind you that in the description is a link to download my free rock and metal mixing cheat sheet. There's a lot of really good go-to EQ and compression settings for every instrument in a rock and metal song. I want to thank you so much for your time and attention today. My name is Bobby Balo. I'm the mixing and mastering engineer at Raytown Productions, and I'll see you in another video.